Okay, so ready to dive deep into this one.
Always ready for a depth dive, especially when it comes to, well, making math classrooms actually about thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this book, Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics by Peter Liljedahl, I mean, talk about a gold mine.
It's not just theory, is it? It's like he's right there in the trenches with you.
Totally. He's got all this research, like 15 plus years worth, but then he brings it down to earth with real classroom stories and examples.
Exactly. So we're not just getting abstract ideas, you know. We're getting a roadmap of what actually works. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're going to basically go chapter by chapter and pull out those core concepts, those actionable strategies. Like, think of this as your cheat sheet for transforming your math classroom into a, thinking haven or something.
I love that, a thinking haven. And you know what's so interesting is how Liljedahl's own journey kind of mirrors that transformation. Like initially he thought the key was finding those perfect problems, the ones that would magically make students think.
I've been there, hunting for that perfect problem set.
Right. But then he had this like aha moment where he realized the classroom environment itself plays a huge role.
It's like setting the stage for a play. You can have the best actors, the most amazing script, but if the stage isn't set right, it's just not going to work.
Exactly. So chapter 1 jumps right into this idea, what types of tasks actually fuel a thinking classroom. And he breaks them down into these 3 categories: non-curricular brain teasers, curriculum-focused problems, and then what he calls mimicking tasks.
Mimicking tasks. Okay. So is that like those, now you try one, problems that we've all seen?
Yeah, exactly. Those, and I'll admit I used to use those all the time, thinking I was giving students good practice.
I know, me too.
But his research actually shows that those tasks can lead to some, let's say, less than ideal behaviors.
Like what? Give me some examples.
So you'll see students slacking, stalling, faking, or just straight up mimicking what the teacher did.
Anything but thinking, basically.
Right. But he's not saying we should chuck out all curriculum-focused tasks,
Good, because those are kind of important.
He actually shows how even those, scripted textbook problems, even those can be effective if we do it right.
So how do we do it right?
It's all about setting the stage, getting students in that thinking mode first.
So it's like those brain teasers or the warm-up act. They get those mental muscles flexed and ready to go.
Exactly. And then when you hit them with the main event, the curriculum-focused problems, they're like primed to tackle them.
Makes sense. Okay, so chapter 2 dives into how we form groups. How do we do collaborative groups in a thinking classroom?
Okay, so get this. He's a huge advocate for randomized grouping.
Wait, really? I can already hear the gasps from some teachers out there.
Oh, I know, right? Like random groups, that's chaos waiting to happen.
Yeah.
But Liljedahl addresses all those concerns head on.
Like, what are some of the big worries?
Well, teachers worry about students who always end up off task, or, the groups just becoming social hour instead of work time.
Okay, so valid concerns.
Totally valid. But he's got all this research showing how frequent, visibly random grouping can actually boost thinking and engagement.
So there's a method to the madness. It's not just like throwing names in a hat and hoping for the best.
Nope, it's strategic, and there's a whole section, like a FAQ, at the end of each chapter debunking those myths and addressing those practical concerns.
That's so smart. I love that he anticipates those questions. Okay, so let's break down the benefits of these random groups. Why are they so great?
Well, one big thing is it takes away, those social anxieties that come with self-selected groups.
Yeah, and those power dynamics, too. It's like who's in and who's out.
Right. But when students know the groups are truly random, they just kind of accept them and get to work.
I can see that. It takes the pressure off those social dynamics. Yeah.
Totally. And then another big benefit is it creates what he calls knowledge mobility. Think of it as like cross-pollination of ideas.
So they're constantly interacting with different classmates.
Exactly. And that exposes them to new perspectives, new ways of thinking.
Okay, I'm liking this idea more and more. So what about group size? Does he have any recommendations?
Yeah, he says groups of 3 seem to hit that sweet spot.
Like Goldilocks and the Three Bears.
Yeah.
Not too big, not too small.
Right. Enough overlap to spark discussion, but also enough difference to make it generative. So it's that balance of redundancy and diversity.
Okay, love it. So we've talked about tasks, we've talked about groups. What about the actual physical space? Where does all this thinking and collaborating happen?
Well, chapter 3 is all about vertical non-permanent surfaces, or VNPSs for short.
Okay, so we're ditching the desks and embracing the whiteboards, the windows, walls, anything goes.
Pretty much. He tells this great story about a teacher who was super skeptical about VMPSs at first. Like, she thought her students would just draw on the walls.
I can see that.
But then she was amazed by how, like, just that simple act of making their work visible, it transformed the whole classroom.
It's like turning the classroom into a giant collaborative whiteboard where everyone's thinking is on display.
Exactly. And because the work isn't trapped in those individual notebooks,
They can see each other's solutions. They can build on each other's ideas. They can learn from each other's mistakes.
it's all out in the open. And it creates this amazing sense of shared ownership and accountability.
Okay, I'm convinced.
Yeah.
So now I'm curious about Chapter 4. We've got the tasks, we've got the groups, we've got the workspaces. What about the overall layout of the classroom?
Well, Liljedahl is all about what he calls defronting the classroom.
Defronting. Okay, explain.
So basically, he says, say goodbye to that traditional setup with the teacher's desk front and center and rows of desks all facing forward.
Yeah, that old school style.
Right. It's all about breaking free from that teacher-centric model and creating a space that signals, collaboration and student-led learning.
So, like, what would that look like? How do you defront a classroom?
Well, he suggests, like, arranging desks in clusters or circles with the teacher kind of moving around the room, facilitating discussions and acting as a guide on the side.
I like it. It sends that message. This is your space to learn and explore. The old way of doing things is gone.
Right. And it's not just about the desks. It's about that whole atmosphere, creating a space where students feel comfortable taking risks, making mistakes, and really sharing their ideas.
Speaking of sharing ideas, Chapter 5 delves into a topic that I think every teacher can relate to. How to answer student questions in a way that actually keeps thinking alive.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one. And he identifies two types of questions that can really derail a thinking classroom. Proximity questions and stop thinking questions.
Okay, break those down for me.
So proximity questions are those logistical ones, like where do we turn this in? Or am I supposed to be in this group?
Okay, so just seeking clarification, really.
Exactly. And then stop thinking questions are the ones where students are basically asking for the answer,
Like, is this right? Or how do I solve this?
Bingo. Now, here's the thing. His solution might sound a little counterintuitive at first. He says, smile and walk away.
Wait, really? Smile and walk away? I mean, I get that for the logistical questions, but what about when they're genuinely stuck and need help?
It's about resisting that urge to jump in and rescue them, Instead of giving the answer, try redirecting the question back to the group, prompting them to look at their notes. Just encourage them to keep wrestling with it a bit longer.
So we're empowering them to use their resources, their problem-solving skills.
Right. And here's a little pro tip from Liljedahl. Don't explain this approach to students beforehand. Just start doing it.
Like actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. Then after a while, you can kind of debrief and explain why you're doing it.
Okay, I like that. So let's move on to Chapter 6, which is all about when, where, and how we introduce those tasks. The timing of it all.
Okay, so Liljedahl is a big believer in introducing the task right at the beginning of the lesson. No warm-ups, no review, just jump right into that challenging problem.
Interesting. I think a lot of teachers, myself included, we tend to ease into it.
Right.
Like start with some review or maybe some direct instruction and then get to the activity.
But he argues that if you start with a lecture or, direct instruction, you're basically priming them for passive learning.
Yeah, they're in listening and note-taking mode, not thinking mode.
Exactly. So by hitting them with the task first, you're grabbing their attention, you're setting the stage for active learning right from the get-go.
You're sparking that curiosity.
Yeah.
Like, what is this? What are we doing?
And he also recommends giving tasks verbally, which I think adds to that intrigue.
It's like setting the stage for a mathematical mystery. Okay, let's talk about homework. I'm sure everyone's favorite topic. Chapter 7 tackles this often dreaded aspect of teaching and learning.
Oh, yeah, homework. So does Liljedahl advocate for banning it altogether?
Please say yes.
Well, not quite, but he does propose a pretty radical shift in how we think about and use it. Like, he suggests moving away from that homework label and instead calling it check your understanding questions.
Check your understanding.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. It takes the pressure off,
Right. It's less about completing assignments for points and more about genuine self-assessment.
And are these check your understanding questions graded?
Nope. They're purely for students to gauge their own understanding and identify areas where they might need to revisit the material.
So it's all about encouraging them to take ownership.
Exactly. And to be active participants in that feedback process. Now, Chapter 8 goes even deeper into this idea of student ownership, It's all about fostering autonomy.
Autonomy. Giving students that sense of control over their learning, It sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make that happen in the classroom?
Well, Liljedahl gives us some really concrete strategies, and one of the most surprising is be deliberately less helpful.
Wait, what? Be less helpful. Isn't our job to be helpful?
It's about resisting that urge to jump in and rescue them the moment they hit a snag, you know? Instead of providing those step-by-step instructions, redirect them back to their group, encourage them to look at their notes, or just give them space to grapple with it.
Okay, so we're showing them we believe in their ability to figure things out.
Exactly. And giving them the opportunity to experience that aha moment for themselves. Instead of being the sole source of knowledge, you become a facilitator, you know?
You're helping them tap into the collective wisdom of the classroom.
Right. Now, Chapter 9 explores those tools that we can use to support that process, you know? It's all about using hints and extensions to keep students in that sweet spot of flow.
That flow state where they're challenged but not overwhelmed.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that timing and tailoring are key here.
So hints and extensions should be specific to each group.
Yes, based on their unique needs and where they're at in the problem-solving process.
So it's differentiation in action, constantly reading the room and providing just the right amount of support at just the right time.
And then he also introduces this idea of different modes of engagement.
Modes of engagement. Okay, I'm listening.
So it starts with students just doing the task, Then it moves to justifying their solutions, explaining their reasoning, and ultimately teaching the concept to others.
So it's like they're climbing this ladder of understanding.
Exactly. Each rung represents a deeper level of engagement and mastery. But this idea of everyone moving at their own pace raises a really interesting challenge.
What's that?
How do you consolidate a lesson when everyone's at different points in their understanding? That's what Chapter 10 dives into.
Consolidation. That moment when we bring it all together and try to make sense of all the different ideas that have emerged.
Right. And traditionally, a lot of teachers tend to, level to the top, right?
Yeah. We showcase the most elegant solution or the most advanced thinking and hope that everyone can follow along.
But Liljedahl proposes something completely different, leveling to the bottom.
Leveling to the bottom. Okay. I'm intrigued.
Instead of starting with the most complex solution, you start with the solution that every group was able to achieve.
So you're meeting them where they are and building up from a shared foundation.
Exactly. And then as you work your way up to those more sophisticated solutions, you're constantly connecting back to their prior knowledge, helping them see how those building blocks fit together.
So it's a much more inclusive approach.
Hmm.
It honors the diversity of thinking in the classroom.
Absolutely. And he really encourages teachers to use student work to guide that consolidation process, not just relying on teacher-generated examples.
Make their thinking visible, value their contributions. I love that. Okay, so we've got students thinking, collaborating, problem solving. Now, I'm curious about note-taking. Chapter 11 tackles this often overlooked aspect of learning.
Note-taking. It's funny how much time students spend taking notes, but how much of that is actually meaningful or useful?
Right. We've all seen those students diligently copying down every word. But is it sinking in?
So Liljedahl argues that traditional note-taking can be a pretty mindless exercise if we're not careful. He's all about meaningful notes.
Meaningful notes? Okay, so
Okay.
what does that look like?
Well, he has this brilliant way of framing it. He says students should take notes for their future forgetful selves.
Haha. I love that. We've all been there staring at our old notes thinking, what was I even trying to say here?
Exactly. So instead of passively copying down information, they should be capturing those key insights, strategies, aha moments that will actually help them make sense of it later on.
It's like creating a cheat sheet for future success. And I know a lot of teachers, myself included, we share our slides or notes online. Does he have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, he says students are more likely to take meaningful notes if they believe the information isn't readily available elsewhere. So if you're going to share your stuff, do it after they've taken their own notes.
That's so smart. It takes away that why bother mentality and makes them think, okay, I need to capture this because it might not be there later.
Right. And he also talks about using graphic organizers as a tool to support meaningful note-taking.
Graphic organizers. Love them. They can be such a game changer, especially for students who struggle with those traditional linear notes.
Yeah, totally. And there are so many different types to choose from: concept maps, flowcharts, Venn diagrams, the list goes on.
So many options.
He gives a ton of examples in the book, but he also encourages us to be creative, experiment to find what clicks with our students.
Provide that structure without being overly prescriptive.
Exactly. Now, Chapter 12 is where things get really interesting. It's all about assessment in a thinking classroom.
Assessment. That word can strike fear in the hearts of teachers and students alike.
I know. But in a thinking classroom, assessment isn't about, catching students out or, just measuring their ability to memorize facts and procedures.
Just about assessing for understanding.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about looking at those higher order thinking skills, those problem solving skills,
Hmm.
the ability to communicate, their reasoning, their collaboration, their perseverance, all of that.
And how do we assess those things?
Well, he actually proposes a really interesting alternative to those generic four-column rubrics.
Those rubrics can be so limiting and impersonal.
I know, right? So he suggests co-creating rubrics with students.
Co-creating rubrics. Okay, tell me more.
So instead of handing them a pre-made rubric, you involve them in the process of defining what quality looks like.
So they're not just following the rubric, they're helping to create it, which means they're really thinking deeply about those learning goals and expectations.
And it gives them a voice in the assessment process,
Yeah, I love that.
which can make the whole experience a lot more meaningful and authentic. Now, Chapter 13 takes a closer look at formative assessment.
Formative assessment, those ongoing checks for understanding that help us guide our instruction.
And supports student learning. Liljedahl introduces this really cool tool called the navigation instrument.
A navigation instrument. Okay, I'm intrigued.
It's basically a tool that helps students track their mastery of those learning outcomes and identify those areas where they need to focus.
So it's like a roadmap for their learning journey,
Exactly. And the key is that it's visual and it's personalized.
like a GPS for learning. And it really puts them in the driver's seat.
Right. And he emphasizes that feedback is crucial.
Feedback is huge.
But we're not talking about those vague comments like, good job or needs work.
Oh, no, those are useless.
Right. Feedback should be specific, constructive, and focused on helping students actually move forward.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, so actionable feedback tied to those learning outcomes.
You got it. Now, this all leads us to Chapter 14, which tackles the big, scary topic of grading.
Grading, everyone's favorite topic.
But Liljedahl actually makes it really interesting because he helps us shift our mindset. He makes this really important distinction between what he calls a point-gathering paradigm versus a data-gathering paradigm.
Okay, point gathering versus data gathering. Break that down for me.
So in that traditional point-gathering model, every assignment is assigned a point value, and grades are calculated based on, this accumulation of points.
It's like students are earning points in a game.
Yeah.
It can feel very transactional.
Right, and it often doesn't accurately reflect what they've actually learned. So Liljedahl argues for a data-gathering approach.
Where we're viewing assessments as opportunities to collect evidence of student learning.
Exactly. And using that evidence to inform our grading decisions.
So we're not just focused on the points, we're looking at the bigger picture.
And he suggests that we gather data from a variety of sources, not just tests and quizzes.
So like what? Give me some examples.
Student work observations, conversations, anything that gives us insight into their thinking.
So we're getting a more holistic view of their understanding.
Exactly. And he also makes a really compelling case for using a standards-based grading approach where students are assessed on their mastery of specific learning goals rather than being compared to their peers.
I love that approach.
Yeah.
It really takes the pressure off and encourages them to focus on their own individual progress.
And get this, he even suggests that students who have already demonstrated mastery of a concept might not need to take a traditional test at all.
Whoa. Now that's radical.
Right. But it makes so much sense if we're truly focused on what they know and can do. Okay, so Chapter 15 is where it all comes together.
The grand finale. The big picture.
It's basically a roadmap for implementing this whole thinking classroom framework.
And he actually organizes the 14 practices into 4 distinct toolkits.
Toolkits, I like that.
Me too. So tell me more about this toolkit approach. Why toolkits?
Well, it's a brilliant way to make the implementation process less overwhelming. Think of it like building a house. You wouldn't try to put up the walls before you lay the foundation right.
Okay, great analogy.
Yeah.
So which practices form that essential foundation for a thinking classroom?
The first toolkit is all about establishing that culture of thinking we've been talking about. So that's where you bring in those engaging thinking tasks, those visibly random groups, and get those students up and working on those VNPSs.
It's all about creating that safe space where they can explore, collaborate, and take risks.
Exactly. And once that foundation is solid, then you can move to the second toolkit, which is all about giving students the tools and strategies they need to actually think effectively.
So this is where we bring in those powerful questioning techniques that defronted classroom layout and start, mobilizing knowledge by being deliberately less helpful.
You got it. Then the third toolkit focuses on using formative assessment to guide and support student learning.
And this is where those navigation instruments and those meaningful note-taking strategies really come into play.
Right. Giving them that roadmap of where they are, where they're going, and how to get there.
I love that. And then the fourth toolkit helps us tackle the grading piece, making sure our grading practices actually align with the values of a thinking classroom.
Right. Moving away from that point gathering mentality and embracing that data gathering approach we talked about.
So it's like a complete paradigm shift.
Yeah.
But Liljedahl emphasizes that this framework is adaptable.
Yeah.
It's not a rigid set of rules. It's a set of guiding principles that you can tailor to fit your own style and your students' needs.
Exactly. And he reminds us to keep the forest in mind as we navigate the trees of individual practices.
So don't get so caught up in the details that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. The bigger picture is creating a classroom where students are thinking, engaged, and empowered.
And that's a goal worth striving for.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like, those nesting dolls. Each toolkit fits inside the next.
Okay, so tell me more about the order. Like, why is the order so important?
It's all about laying the groundwork. Some practices have to be in place before others can really take root.
Makes sense? Okay, so remind me which toolkit is that foundation, the one we build everything else on top of.
So toolkit number 1 is all about establishing that culture of thinking. Those visibly random groups, those VNPSs, and those engaging thinking tasks.
It's like setting the stage you said earlier,
Yeah.
creating that space where thinking is valued and celebrated.
And safe, where it's okay to make mistakes, to try different approaches.
Okay, so once we've got that culture in place, what comes next? What's in toolkit number 2?
So toolkit number 2 is about giving students the actual tools and strategies they need to think effectively.
Like, okay, how do I actually do this thinking thing you're talking about?
Exactly. So that's where those powerful questioning techniques come in. That defronted classroom layout we talked about, and remember, being deliberately less helpful.
Right. It's like we're stepping back and letting them take the reins a bit more.
Exactly. And then toolkit number 3 is all about formative assessment, using those ongoing checks for understanding to guide and support their learning.
So those navigation instruments, those meaningful note-taking strategies, all of that comes into play here.
Right. It's about giving them that clear roadmap, so they can track their progress and make adjustments along the way.
I love that. And then the fourth and final toolkit helps us with the grading piece, making sure our grading practices actually align with this whole thinking classroom philosophy.
Exactly. It's about moving away from that traditional point gathering model and embracing that data gathering approach.
Okay, so big picture time. Liljedahl gives us these 14 practices, these 4 toolkits. It's a lot to take in. What advice does he have for teachers who are, ready to dive in and start implementing all of this? Where do we even begin?
So he's very clear about this, He says, start small, don't try to do everything at once.
Okay, good, because that would be overwhelming.
Totally overwhelming. So pick 1 or 2 practices that really resonate with you, the ones you think will have the biggest impact. Like, maybe start with those visibly random groups and those VNPSs and go from there.
And then gradually incorporate more as you get comfortable. It's a journey, right? Not a race.
Exactly. And it's not about being perfect. It's about being intentional,
Right.
reflecting on what's working, what's not working, and adjusting your approach as needed.
That resonates with me so much because it takes the pressure off. It's not about getting it all right on the first try. It's about constantly learning and growing and evolving as a teacher.
Absolutely. And finding what works for you and your students.
And he also talks about finding a thinking partner, another teacher who's on this journey with you.
Oh, yeah. Having that support system is so important.
Someone to bounce ideas off of, to celebrate those successes with, and to, commiserate with when things get tough.
And to troubleshoot, because there are going to be challenges along the way.
Totally. But like he says, celebrate those small victories along the way. Those moments when you see students engaged and persevering and having those aha moments.
Those are the moments that remind us why we do this,
Some pure magic. Okay, so speaking of celebrating small victories, let's circle back to chapter 11 for a moment.
Note-taking time.
Note-taking time. I just love how Liljedahl reframes this whole thing as, taking notes for your future forgetful self.
It's so brilliant and so relatable because we've all been there,
Yeah.
Staring at our old notes thinking, what in the world was I even trying to say here?
Totally. Okay, so help me out here. Remind me, what are those key takeaways from chapter 11? Like, how do we help students take meaningful notes notes that they'll actually use and understand later on.
Well, I think one big thing is encouraging them to focus on capturing those key insights, those aha moments, those strategies, instead of just mindlessly copying everything
It's
down.
about distilling it down to the essence.
Exactly. And remember, he also talks about the timing of sharing resources. Like
There
if
you
you're
go.
planning to post your slides or notes online, do it after they've taken their own.
Because otherwise they'll just think, oh, I don't need to take notes. I can just get it later.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
that defeats the whole purpose.
makes sense. And I know you're also a big fan of graphic organizers.
Oh, yeah. Graphic organizers are a game changer, especially for students who struggle with traditional linear notes. It gives them that visual framework to organize the information.
And Liljedahl gives tons of examples in the book, right?
Tons. Concept maps, flowcharts, Venn diagrams, you name it. But he also encourages us to be creative, you know? Experiment to find what resonates with our students.
And to let them get creative too.
Yeah,
Maybe they want to come up with their own way of organizing the information.
absolutely. The goal is for them to capture the information in a way that makes sense to them, using their own words, their own diagrams, whatever helps them solidify those connections. So it's like we're giving them the tools and the freedom to create their own personalized learning aids.
Okay, so we've talked about note-taking. Let's shift gears now and talk about assessment.
Assessment time, always a fun topic, right?
It can be a bit daunting, but I think Chapter 12 really challenges us to rethink how we assess student learning, especially in a thinking classroom.
It's about moving beyond those traditional tests and quizzes,
Yeah.
the ones that often just focus on rote memorization or procedural fluency.
We need to go deeper.
Right. We need to assess those higher order thinking skills, those problem-solving skills, the ability to communicate their reasoning, to collaborate, to persevere.
All those skills that are actually going to prepare them for success in the real world.
Exactly. So instead of just focusing on, can you get the right answer? We're asking, can you explain your thinking? Can you justify your solution? Can you work effectively with others? All of that.
Okay, so love that.
Yeah.
But how do we actually assess those things? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Well, remember those generic four-column rubrics we talked about earlier? The
Yeah.
ones that can feel so impersonal and limiting?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of those.
So Liljedahl proposes a really interesting alternative, co-creating rubrics with students.
Wait, co-creating rubrics, that sounds amazing.
It is. So instead of just handing them a pre-made rubric, you actually involve them in the process of defining what quality looks like for a specific task or skill.
So they're not just following the rubric, they're helping to create it, which means they have to really think about what it means to be proficient, what those expectations are.
Exactly. It's such a powerful way to give them a voice in the assessment process and to promote that metacognitive awareness.
I love that. I'm totally going to try that. Okay, so Chapter 13 delves into formative assessment, those ongoing checks for understanding that help us guide our instruction.
And support student learning. Remember that cool tool Liljedahl introduces, the navigation instrument?
Oh, yeah, the navigation instrument. It's like a GPS for learning.
Right. So it's basically a tool that helps students visualize their mastery of those learning outcomes. It could be a chart, a checklist, a graph, whatever format works best for you and your students.
Key is that it's visual and it's personalized, right?
Exactly. It gives them that clear picture of where they are in their learning, where they're heading, and how to get there. And they're in the driver's seat.
I love that. And he also emphasizes that feedback is such a crucial part of this process, right?
Oh, absolutely. But remember, we're not talking about those vague comments like, good job, or needs work.
We're talking about specific, actionable feedback that's tied to those learning outcomes outlined in the navigation instrument.
Yes. Feedback that actually helps them move forward. Okay. Now, this all leads us to the topic that I think a lot of teachers struggle with. Grading. Chapter 14 tackles this thorny issue head on.
Grading, oh yeah, it's a tough one. It can be so hard to find that balance between being fair and accurate and also, reflecting the growth and effort that we see in our students.
It really is. But Liljedahl offers some really practical advice for shifting our mindset at our practices. Remember that distinction he makes between point gathering and data gathering?
Oh yeah, that's a game changer. It's about viewing assessments as opportunities to collect evidence of student learning rather than just assigning points for every little thing.
Exactly. And he suggests gathering data from a variety of sources, not just tests and quizzes, but, observations, conversations, student products, anything that gives us insight into their thinking.
It's about getting a holistic picture.
Right. And then he also advocates for using a standards-based grading approach where students are assessed on their mastery of those specific learning goals rather than being compared to their peers.
I love that approach
Mm,
because it really encourages students to focus on their own individual progress, and it promotes that growth mindset.
absolutely. And then he even suggests that students who have already demonstrated mastery of a particular concept might not even need to take a traditional test.
Whoa, okay, that's next level.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's radical, but it makes sense if we're truly trying to assess what they know and can do. Okay, so are you ready for the grand finale? Chapter 15 is where it all comes together.
Bring it on. So Liljedahl gives us these 14 practices, these 4 toolkits. It's a lot to take in. How do we make sense of it all?
Well, he actually lays out a really clear roadmap for implementing this whole thinking classroom framework. And I love how he breaks it down into those manageable chunks, like those toolkits we talked about.
Toolkits for the win.
Right. So he talks about the order in which you should implement these toolkits, which is super important because some practices really lay the groundwork for others.
All about building that strong foundation right.
Exactly. So toolkit number 1 is all about establishing that culture of thinking. Those visibly random groups, those VNPSs and those engaging thinking tasks, that's where we start.
It's all about creating that space that's conducive to thinking, that's safe and supportive and encouraging of risk-taking.
Exactly. And once that foundation is in place, then we can move on to toolkit number 2, which is about giving students those tools and strategies they need to think effectively. So that's where we introduce those powerful questioning techniques, shift to that defronted classroom layout, and really start mobilizing knowledge by being deliberately less helpful.
Right. We're stepping back and giving them more ownership over their learning.
And then toolkit number 3 is all about formative assessment, using those ongoing checks for understanding to guide and support student learning. So those navigation instruments, those meaningful note-taking strategies, all of that comes into play here.
It's about giving students that roadmap,
hmm
so they can track their progress and make adjustments along the way.
Exactly. And then finally, toolkit number 4 helps us with the grading piece, making sure our grading practices align with those thinking classroom values, moving away from point gathering and embracing that data gathering approach.
So it's like a complete paradigm shift. But one thing that Liljedahl emphasizes is that this framework is adaptable. It's not like this rigid set of rules. It's a set of guiding principles that you can tailor to fit your own style and your students' needs.
Exactly. And he reminds us to keep the forest in mind as we navigate the trees of individual practices.
So don't get so caught up in the details that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
The bigger picture is creating a classroom where students are thinking, engaged, and empowered.
That's what it's all about, right?
Absolutely.
It's so true. As we've been going through all these practices, I keep thinking about how they all fit together,
Yeah.
Like, it's not enough to just do 1 or 2 of these things in isolation.
It's like a system.
Yeah.
All the pieces work together to create this whole greater than the sum of its parts kind of thing.
Totally. It's like that idea of synergy, right? Like 1 + 1 = 3.
Exactly. And he even gives specific examples in the book of how these practices can be woven together in a lesson. It's really cool to see it all come together.
So, like, paint me a picture. What does this look like in action?
Okay, so imagine your students are up at those VNPSs, right? They're working on a challenging task, they're collaborating in their randomly assigned groups, and they're using their meaningful notes as a resource. They're having those rich mathematical discussions, and they're seeking hints and extensions when they get stuck.
I can see it. It's like this beautiful dance.
It is. And because their thinking is visible on those VNPSs, you can easily walk around, observe their progress, provide targeted feedback. It's like you're constantly gathering data to inform your formative assessment.
And that smile and walk away strategy becomes so much more powerful when you've already established that culture of thinking right.
Oh, absolutely. Because students know you're not abandoning them.
You're empowering them. You're giving them that space to struggle a bit, to rely on their own resources and on each other.
It's all about trust.
Okay, I know some of our listeners might be feeling a bit overwhelmed right now. We've covered a lot. So if you're ready to dive in and start implementing this framework, what advice does Liljedahl offer? Where do we begin?
He's all about starting small. you know? Don't try to do everything at once.
That'll be way too much.
Right. So pick 1 or 2 practices that really speak to you that you think will make the biggest difference in your classroom and go from there.
So like maybe start with those visibly random groups and VNPSs.
Exactly. And then gradually layer in more practices as you get more comfortable.
And remember, it's a journey, right? Not a destination.
It's all about continuous improvement for us as teachers and for our students.
And, he also talks about the importance of finding a thinking partner, another teacher who's on this journey with you. Like Having that support system can make all the difference.
Oh, yeah, totally. Someone to share ideas with, to celebrate those successes, and to, commiserate with when things get tough, because
Yeah.
it's not always going to be easy, you know?
Yeah, there will definitely be bumps in the road, but like he says, celebrate those small victories along the way. Those moments when you see a student's eyes light up when they have that aha
Mhm.
moment when they persevere through a challenge.
Those moments make it all worthwhile, you
Yeah,
know?
totally. So as we wrap up this deep dive into building thinking classrooms in mathematics, I'm curious, what are you most excited to try in your own classroom? What's resonating with you?
Honestly, for me, it's the power of those VMPSs. I just think it's going to be so amazing to see students' thinking come to life on those walls.
I'm with you there. I think it's going to be a game changer. And I'm also really intrigued by that idea of co-creating rubrics with students. Like, what a powerful way to give them ownership and make assessment more meaningful.
It's all about shifting our mindset, creating a learning environment where thinking is at the center of everything we do.
And I'm also really excited to try those visibly random groups. I think it's going to shake things up in a really positive way. So, for all of you listening out there, we encourage you to take some time to reflect on what we've talked about today. Which practices resonate with you the most? What small steps can you take to start building a thinking classroom in your own practice? This deep dive is just the beginning. The real journey starts when you step into your classroom and embrace the power of student thinking.